Alright guys, so welcome to today's Saturday session with Exam Revision. As you can tell by the screen, we're going to be looking at the Anglo-Irish Treaty, really focusing in on, I suppose, our exam skills. We're coming towards the end of our 2-year cycle of senior cycle history, and we need to start, I suppose, just thinking about how we're going to use the information that we study in an exam situation. So there's going to be a heavy focus on where do our case studies from, I suppose, our Irish history section of the course fit into our exam techniques. So before we get going, I'd just like to highlight the midterm February revision courses that are being offered via ExamRevision. So you can get 100% exam ready at our Leaving Cert February intensive revision course. You get a lot of exam technique, H1 notes, live and on demand, where you can stop and ask, I suppose, check for understanding, clarify any questions that you have with the expert teachers that ExamRevision have. You're going to get key tips from written examiners, focus on the most common topics that comes up, and there'll be discussion around probable exam questions for the 2022 Leaving Cert. So you can see the subjects that are available. It stretches much further past history. We have English, maths, biology, chemistry, physics, Spanish, French, geography, and history. So I definitely head on over to the ExamRevision website to have a look what's on offer there. Once again, I'll just highlight you towards the Leaving Cert History part of the ExamRevision course. So if you sign up for ExamRevision and Leaving Cert History as one of your subjects, you can see that the whole course is covered. When I say the whole course is covered, what is offered for every single topic that has ever come up in the Leaving Cert History exam is I'll click onto the Montgomery bus boycott here. You'll see there's video tutorials of myself actually going through the topic in extensive detail. Those videos range anywhere between 10-17 minutes is on the high end, just as it's one of our case studies and really important. There's self-correcting quizzes available there, so multiple choice quizzes where you can test yourself after completing the video tutorials. You get a H1 set of notes alongside of that, so all the information in note format. You can see in Leaving Cert History, I do like to, I suppose, use timelines, place events in chronological order like that, so I like to have a visual representation of the topics that we study as well. That's all available on ExamRevision's Leaving Cert History part of the course there. Last thing before we get into today, so if you are attending today's Saturday session, you can use the code ANGLO20 to get 20% off standard and premium plans on ExamRevision's website. So that's valid until tomorrow night, Sunday the 13th of February. So if you're looking to avail of that offer, 20%, I'd head over and use that straight away, guys. So straight into today then, as I said, there's going to be a heavy exam focus around what we're covering today. So where does our case study here fit into an exam situation? Where are we going to be using it come June when we sit our Leaving Cert History exam? So these are all, I suppose, I only really cover up from 2008 onwards, but these are the typical exam questions that have came up around the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which is one of our case studies from our Irish history section of the course. So we'll read through a couple of these essay titles here. Why were both the negotiations and terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty 1921 controversial? Now I've underlined a few words here. You might actually just take note of that word that's underlined. It's going to be really important when we look at how we implement this in an essay style question. So 2018, why were both the negotiation and terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty controversial? Once again. 2016, why did the conduct and the outcome of the treaty negotiations prove contentious? So another word for controversy or causing division. To what extent was the Anglo-Irish Treaty responsible for the Irish Civil War? So once again, coming back to that term, controversial, how it caused division in Irish society. I'm going to show you how we're using and reading the exam questions that come up, recycling those words in our answers to pump up our score essentially at Leaving Cert History. So for this topic, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, there's essentially 4 different areas that we can break down what we need to know. So firstly, we'll look at the preliminary negotiations between July and October between De Valera himself. We'll look at the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations October to December 1921. So relevant at the moment as well, just I suppose it was the centenary of this Anglo-Irish Treaty this January, essentially last October to December. There's currently an amazing exhibition on in Dublin Castle looking at, I suppose, all primary sources, artifacts from this Anglo-Irish treaty. The Irish treaty itself is there. It's amazing to go see. I've actually taken one of my Leaving Cert History groups to view the exhibition. I'd absolutely recommend going to see it if you are a Leaving Cert History student. There's so many amazing quotes that you could use in your essays. It's a fountain of knowledge there, and it's free. So it's there until, I'm going to say, mid-March. So I'd absolutely recommend getting yourselves down to see that. And it just gives you a different way to engage with the course content. That's, I suppose, should be our overarching goal. How can I engage with the course content or the things that I need to be studying in different ways, so it doesn't actually feel like rote learning or studying. So thirdly, we're going to look at the division in Ireland over the treaty. And that's it. So 3 different areas. So before we get into the content here, as I said, this is going to be heavy exam focus. What I want you guys as students to be able to do after you leave this Saturday session is use this information in an exam situation, because we're coming to that time of the year, I suppose, where our exam focus or our exam switch is flicked on, and we need to start focusing on how are we going, I suppose, to use the information that we study in an exam situation. So before we get into the content here, and I'm going to go through this in extensive detail, let's have a look at the marking scheme for Leaving Cert History. And let's, I suppose, just be a little bit smart about how we use our information. How are we going to use the marking scheme to guide our study and to guide, the length and the type of essays that we write in Leaving Cert History. I can't stress enough how important it is as Leaving Cert History students to actually have a good understanding of the marking scheme and to kind of start to think or try to think like an examiner at this stage. That's what I always kind of recommend to my students. So in Leaving Cert History exams, of course, you're going to write your documents-based questions and 3 essays. Now this year, obviously the exams have been adjusted. You guys are going to answer your documents-based question and 2 essays, which is really nice. Gives you loads of actual thinking time in your exam, which traditionally students wouldn't have a lot of time to think in a Leaving Cert History exam, because it's so, I suppose, it's such a time pressurized environment. This year you're going to have thinking time, and this is why it's important, even more so in this year, that we understand the marking scheme and how an examiner is going to be marking your Leaving Cert History paper. So when you're writing a Leaving Cert History essay, the examiner is looking for 2 different things. Their cumulative mark, which I'm going to refer to as CM moving forward, and our overall evaluation. So your CM is worth 60 marks and your OE is worth 40 marks. So I'm going to break them down, I suppose, just in student-friendly terms now. But this is what it would look like for us as an examiner if we were or when we see the marking paper. So this is our cumulative mark sliding scale. I'm going to explain it in student-friendly terms next, but I'm just going to highlight this word to you before we move on. Analysis. So an excellent paragraph that achieves 11 to 12 cumulative mark CM must provide analysis, exposition, or commentary. Now that's going to dictate how we write our Leaving Cert essay. So it's really important you guys as students understand the type of, I suppose, characteristics that examiners are looking for excellent or outstanding paragraphs. Let's have a look at this cumulative mark sliding scale in more student-friendly language. So an excellent paragraph means that student would achieve 11 to 12 marks. The characteristics of that paragraph would be an outstanding piece of analysis, exposition, or commentary, clearly expressed, accurate, and substantial information. Now that's going to be extremely difficult to do. Not a lot of students, very rarely will a student actually achieve 11 to 12 marks in their CM. It's not very common for an examiner to give 11 to 12 an excellent paragraph. I often like to say to my students, you'd almost have to portray that historical event in a new light for the examiner to read, which is an extremely complex skill to do. So we're not really going to be focusing on our excellent paragraphs. This is important. We'll come back to it when we're going to use this to see how many paragraphs and how we write our essays from the marking scheme. So a very good paragraph, 8 to 10, definitely achievable. Very good information, accurately and clearly expressed. I just like to highlight, my pen never works on these lives, guys, so just follow my cursor. I just like to highlight the difference in the characteristics between a very good and excellent paragraph. Now that seems achievable. Very good information, accurate, clearly expressed, is in a different world compared to an outstanding piece of analysis. That's really important. Now we're in the achievable range. A good paragraph, 6 to 7. Worthwhile information, reasonably well expressed. Fair, 3 to 5. None of us really want to be scoring there. limited information, barely stated, poor, none of us hopefully will score in this range, trivial or irrelevant, grave, historical errors throughout. So our cumulative mark, so it's going to be extremely rare to be awarded this 11 to 12 marks on our paragraph. As I've kind of previously alluded to, you'd have to portray that historical event in a new light for the examiner. To provide analysis is extremely hard to do. To provide analysis in such a time pressurized, time sensitive environment that is this Leaving Cert History exam, it's almost impossible to do. Now obviously this year you guys have a bit more leniency with our timing. We have time to think. Maybe we have time to put in a little bit more effort and thinking to provide that analysis to get us up to an excellent paragraph. But in general, it's going to be too time sensitive to get up to that point. What's more achievable and what's, I suppose, more common for students to achieve? The two most common paragraphs that are awarded are good and fair. So 3 to 5 or 6 to 7 marks. And this is going to tell us how many paragraphs we need to write in our essays to maximize the amount of marks we receive. So if you look at a good paragraph, 6 to 7, you're getting worthwhile information, reasonably well expressed. And I stress this to all my students. Every single student who's doing Leaving Cert History at higher level is capable of giving worthwhile information that's reasonably well expressed. I don't think that's asking a lot from the student to do consistently in their paragraphs, and I'm going to come back to that when we look at the sweet spot of essay length and essay or paragraphs length in Leaving Cert History. Before we move on, let's just get an idea of this overall evaluation. So when awarding the OE, examiners are evaluating the quality of your answer by taking the following into account. Now just take note of the word that I've underlined here. To what extent has the student shown the ability to analyze the issues involved? E.g., is it more than just narrative? So what I'm going to stress to my students and what I'm going to stress to you guys here is, in Leaving Cert History, we're not here to tell the story. It's not good enough just to narrate the story of history. We need to try give analysis. We need to try think about the events and the significance of those events, and that's going to be really important. So remember that saying, we're not just here to tell the story in Leaving Cert History, we need to go above and beyond that. Secondly, to what extent has student used relevant evidence to support their analysis? So these are taken directly from our marking scheme. Can you see how much that word analysis is coming up? Once again, that just feeds it into the idea it's not good enough to tell the story of history in Leaving Cert History. We need to go above and beyond that. We need to be thinking about analysis. We need to be thinking about the significance of the events that we're discussing. And then finally, to what extent has the candidate shown the ability to argue a case and to reach conclusions? So what that actually means is, have you answered the question that's been asked? I'm going to show you a little trick that we do in every single paragraph, the start and end of every single paragraph, that's going to bump up our OE here. So that really just kind of highlights to the examiner, look at what I'm doing. I'm answering the question that's being asked here. So this is really important stuff, guys. So the OE is marked on a sliding scale, very similar to what we'd see with our CM. I'm going to highlight one word for you: analysis. So excellent OE, which is anywhere from the range 34 to 40 marks. Excellence in its treatment of the set question, particularly if it shows detailed learning, wide reading, I'm going to come back to that, analysis or extensive coverage. That's our H1 standard. We're all aiming to get up to that point in order to achieve that, and we're going to have a little few tips and tricks to help bump up our OE as we progress. Let's break that down in a little bit more student friendly way. So this is our sliding scale. So the OE is like a snapshot of what the examiner thinks of your essay. They're evaluating the overall quality of it by looking at the student's ability to analyze, using relevant evidence to support the analysis, drawing conclusions, have you answered the question. Let's go through the OE sliding scale from here. So an excellent OE, you'll achieve 34 to 40 marks, and it'll be excellent in its treatment of the set question, particularly if it shows detailed learning, wide reading. So a H1 student in Leaving Cert History needs to be able to show what I'll call evidence of outside reading, viewing, or watching, or reading, viewing, or listening. So reading books, watching documentaries, listening to podcasts, that's going to be really important. You need to show the examiner I'm going above and beyond my history book here to achieve that H1. So using quotes from outside sources, books, documentaries, podcast. We'll get into that at a later point anyway. So we're very good, 28 to 33. Very good but not excellent in its treatment of the set question. Accurate and substantial history. Very good mark to get again. Good, 22 to 27. Good standard of treatment of the set question without being exceptional in the information or commentary supplied. Fair, 16 to 21. Fair attempted at the set question, but has identified defects, e.g. incomplete coverage, irrelevant data, and we go on. I'm not going to go into them because we're definitely not aiming for those. But now what a paragraph could be. So this is taken from our marking scheme as Leaving Cert History teachers and examiners. I'm going to break it down into a little bit more student friendly language here. But what's really important here is, and I'm going to highlight to you, now we know what a paragraph could be, or what a paragraph is going to be made of. So let's break that down first of all. So firstly, it could be an introduction that gives background information, or historiography is essentially what that's called, which defines the key terms or explains the essay's approach. Now I tend to explain the essay's approach in my introductions. I'm going to show you explicitly how we write an introduction. I'm going to give you a very strict set of success criteria, or what I call a formula for you to write your introductions. And I'm going to show you how I do that for the Anglo-Irish Treaty. But I always just like to explain the essay's approach and just kind of get the introduction short, sweet, and out of the way. Secondly, most importantly, what a paragraph could be: an episode, phase, or stage in a sequence of events. So we can only deal with an episode, phase, or stage in a sequence of events. That means we're dealing with one topic at a time, one event at a time, one episode at a time. So if we're looking at Mussolini's Ride to Power, the March on Rome is its separate paragraph, and the 1924 election will be the next paragraph after that. It's really important we understand we're dealing with separate phases, stages by themselves. That's really important. You'll see that when I break down the Anglo-Irish Treaty paragraphs. Thirdly, an aspect of a topic or issue with factual supporting references. A point in an argument or discussion with supporting factual references. I'm just taking a sip of water, guys, sorry. An explanation of a relevant concept with supporting factual references. So if we were dealing with Mussolini's Ride to Power, it might be important you take a paragraph out of your essay to explain the characteristics of fascism, for example. A number of significant relevant facts, explanations, or opinions which, although are not connected, can be taken and assessed as a paragraph equivalent. So that's essentially put in there for the examiner to be able to kind of group some, I suppose, random thoughts together. If you're rushing for time to get it done, they can kind of look to boost your marks there by, I suppose, just tying your information that might be a bit disconnected together. And then finally, a good concluding paragraph, which is not mere repetition. We're going to explicitly go through how we write our intro and our conclusion, giving you that strict set of success criteria, giving you that formula to help you write them. Because from just my own experience, my students, they do struggle writing their intros and their conclusions. That's a skill that we have to develop as we go through our 2 years. So now that leads us up into, where does this affect you in an exam situation? So this is what I call the sweet spot, the 10 paragraph essay. So this is how we use the marking scheme that the examiner is given to dictate or to tell us how much paragraphs we need to write in our essay. Therefore, how long, give or take, our essay is going to be. So this is really important. So each essay you write on your Leaving Cert History paper is marked out of 100 marks. That stays the same this year, even with the changes to the Leaving Cert History paper. As we've looked at, your CM, your cumulative mark, which you get points or which you get marks for historically correct references, is 60 marks. Your overall evaluation, or your OE, accounts for 40 marks, which is the overall evaluation of your ability to analyse and use, I suppose, supporting factual evidence to analyse your essay, is 40 marks. Every single paragraph is marked out of 12 marks. Think back to that sliding scale of our CM. And if we look at the stats and the statistics and the facts behind this, majority of students only receive between 4 to 7 marks per paragraph. Very, very rare, less than 1% of students will get their 12 marks out of 12. An excellent paragraph, remember, an outstanding piece of analysis. Really difficult to do. So we're going to write 10 paragraphs. including an introduction and conclusion, if we're going to score on average 6 out of 10 per paragraph, 60 marks divided by 10 means we only need 6 marks per paragraph. Now I'm being quite, it might not come up, it's hard to come up over when you're speaking online, being a little bit sarcastic here, but I say to my students, can we be consistently average in our Leaving Cert History essays? And the answer is yes, we can. Can we score 6 marks per paragraph? Can we be consistently average? Every single person can. Now I'm being sarcastic saying that, just having a little laugh with it. That, of course, that's not consistently average. That would equate, if we average 6 marks per paragraph, 10 paragraphs in our essay, that's a H1 and our cumulative mark. That's what's really important. So now let's have a look at how we write our paragraphs, or what good historical paragraphs or writing looks like. So I look for 6 different things that outlines good historical writing. So firstly, students must react to the question. This is so important. We need to use our key, like our key word from the question, controversy in the case of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, in the first line while we react. That's going to be important. Next, we state the main point of our argument. We have to provide 6 to 8 historically correct references per paragraph. Now, I don't like to say the word fact there, because remember, we're not just telling the story here, we're looking to go above and beyond and provide analysis. So we need to provide 6 to 8 historically correct references. I'll get into what they look like next. We need to be able to explain at least 2 pieces of those evidence using phrases like this means that, consequently, as a result of. That's really important. That's going above and beyond telling the story of history. We're providing analysis. We need to try to show evidence of outside reading, watching, or listening. Think back to links in our marking scheme there. H1 students who get a H1 34 to 40 in their OE show evidence of wide reading. That's going to be important. Then lastly, we link your argument back to the question, recycling that key word of the question in our answer. Controversy in the case of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Now I'm going to go through the Anglo-Irish Treaty in explicit detail here. Let me just show you an example of what this looks like in a H1 standard paragraph, okay? So this paragraph comes from Leaving Cert question. I'm going to do this for the Anglo-Irish Treaty as well. I just want to show you multiple examples here. This comes from, I suppose, social and economic change introduced by Lenin and Stalin. So this is Lenin's economic policy of war communism. So let's just have a read through this together. I'm going to highlight all the characteristics of good historical writing and how this equates to then that H1 standard. So historians have argued that Vladimir Lenin's economic policies have had profound impacts on the economic landscape of Russia in the early 1920s. War communism was introduced by Lenin with the overriding aim of winning the ongoing. Actually, I'll pause there, okay? Let's read that first sentence. Historians have argued that Vladimir Lenin's economic policies have had profound impacts on the economic landscape of Russia in the early 1920s. First thing that I'm doing is reacting to the question there. Profound impacts on the economy. That's what the question was asking me to do. Next, I need to state my main argument, okay? War communism was introduced by Lenin with the overriding aim of winning the ongoing civil war taking place between the Red Army and the White Revolutionists. Although the passing of all large factories into the hands of the government was successful in mobilizing production towards the war effort, upon reflection, it had detrimental effects on the economy of the country. There's my argument. Okay, this was a good policy in the case of they won the war. However, the economy was gone to the dogs afterwards. So the next thing we need to do now is provide 6 to 8 historically correct references. Let's just note the phrases that I'm using here. Firstly, these are called connective words or linking words. I'm going to show you how we use them in our paragraphs. Firstly, the nationalization of industry in Russia resulted in industrial production falling by 20%. Factories now had little incentive to produce more goods as all profits were funneled through the government. There's me explaining that evidence. Additionally, connective word, workers faced strict discipline to perform in work which negatively affected their performance. Furthermore, workers could now buy very little with their wages as the price of goods rose out of control. This process is referred to as hyperinflation, explaining the evidence. Secondly, agricultural production fell from 80 million tonnes in 1913 to 38 million tonnes in 1931. Consequently, peasants refused to sell their grain as the prices guaranteed by the government were too low. This led to widespread food shortages in the city. This meant, so I'm explaining this evidence, that the Czech and the Red Army were sent into the countryside to seize grain and crush any opposition to the policy. So I'm going to pause there. It's about 8 or 9 historically correct references there, maybe a little bit too much. And I've provided and explained that evidence as we've gone on, using phrases as this process is referred to as hyperinflation. As a result of, I'm explaining that evidence. Last thing I need to do is evidence of outside reading. So I've shown evidence there of linking it into the famines that were experienced in Ukraine. We link our question back to the argument. We can therefore see that although Lenin's economic policy of war communism contributed to a Red Army victory in the Civil War, it had damaging effects on the economy of Russia and resulted in extensive change on future economic policies. Last thing that you can see evident through that is our linking words. Now, I'll be honest with you guys there, that paragraph would probably score 10, 11, 12 on our CM. That's an excellent paragraph. That's what we're all aiming to get towards. But we only really need to be in that 6 range, 6 marks in our cumulative mark, if we're looking to get towards our sweet spot of essays, that 10 paragraph essay. But once again, that's the standard that we're working towards. And I'm going to show you how we get and how we structure our paragraphs to get to this point. Just having a sip of water, guys, sorry. So to structure our paragraphs in order to achieve, I suppose, a good structure throughout, and in order to bump up our OE, help us, I suppose, go beyond telling the story of history and looking to provide analysis and, I suppose, just looking to do that, explain the evidence that we're giving, we're going to follow this P.E.E.L paragraph approach. So in order to make sure that we're following these good characteristics of writing, we're going to use this P.E.E.L approach. So P.E.E.L stands for point, evidence, explain, and link. And I'm going to show you phrases that you can use in your essay that will help structure your answer this way, okay? So phrases, now I literally just get my students to print this off and glue it into the front of their essay copy, okay? And I ask them and I allow my students, even when we're completing timed essays in class, oh yeah, you're allowed flick to your P.E.E.L paragraph approach. So over time, I'm looking to embed that these phrases in my students, and just that my students become familiar and it becomes routine using these phrases in each paragraph to help structure the way that they're writing in order to go above and beyond just telling the story of history. So first thing they have to do is make their point. So phrases that can help students do this. It can be argued that the Anglo-Irish Treaty caused major controversy in Ireland because De Valera did not attend the treaty negotiations himself. Historians have argued, the sources suggest, we can infer from the sources or from the evidence that the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations were controversial because Eamon de Valera did not attend those negotiations himself. That's how we make a point. We use those phrases to help do that. The next thing we need to do is give evidence. So there's 2 different types of evidence that we can give, really. When we look to join ideas, so we'll use phrases like firstly, secondly, in addition, furthermore, moreover. These, I suppose, when you go on to college, these are what we call connective terms or linking terms, and it's integral that you use those in your essay, as it does just contribute towards, I suppose, a better and more academic read. The second type of evidence we can provide or we can use is to change ideas. So we'd use phrases like however, conversely, on the other hand, alternatively, but. After we provide 6 to 8 historically correct references, that's evidence, we need to explain 2 of those. So we use phrases like this means that, therefore, consequently, as a result, because. We use these phrases in our paragraphs to help structure our answers. And then finally, the last thing we need to do to make sure that we show to the examiner that we're answering the question that's been asked, we need to write a linking sentence that links that paragraph to the essay title using the key term from that title. So controversy is the key term when we're looking at the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So we use phrases like, we can therefore see, it is clear from the evidence provided that the most important factor is in conclusion. Now, I can't stress enough how important it is that students start to engage with phrases like this, because it helps structure your paragraphs in a way that makes sure that you're ticking all the boxes. I'm including all the good characteristics of historical writing here in my paragraphs. And how we start using that is literally printing this off, gluing it in our copy, having it in front of us while we're writing an essay, and just start using the phrases as we go. So it's really important that you try and engage with that. So now, when we're planning for Leaving Cert History essays, I like to look at it from two different viewpoints. So we have macro plans, which is big picture. So it's going to guide us where we're going, big picture wise, just with the, I suppose, main topics of our paragraphs. And then micro plans, which are very fine detail, include all the details we need to include within each paragraph of our essay. So this is how I like to plan. Over the course of 2 years, students will build up their macro and micro essay plans. And at this point of the year now, my students will start refining their use, or kind of, I think about it like we're trying, like an athlete trying to peak towards an event. Now we're just using macro plans. So we're able to, I suppose, derive a lot of information or take out a lot of information from just the paragraph topic title. That's going to make sense when I show you the next one. Okay, guys, thanks for sticking with me there through I suppose all of our information around the marking scheme and how we're going to use the marking scheme in an exam situation. That's an exam skill in Leaving Cert History. So in Leaving Cert History, you have your documents-based questions, but there's a lot of historical skills there, like in analysing sources. I suppose you're looking at contextualisation, placing events in history in context of what was going on around that time. You're comparing sources. You're looking at the, I suppose, pros and cons or positives and negatives of different types of sources. There's so much historical skills in that documents-based question, but it's only worth a quarter of your exam. Well, in your case now, it's going to be worth a third of your exam. 66% of your exam is going to be on your ability to write essays, which is a historical skill. Essay writing is a key part of this exam. If you look at, I suppose, this year, your document between your documents-based, or between your RSR and your 2 paragraphs that you'll complete in your Leaving Cert History exam, you're looking at probably about the guts of 70% of your final grade is your ability to write essays. So that's why it's important we build that as a historical skill. That's where we use the marking scheme. We use our sweet spot of essays, 10 paragraphs, which means we only need to score 6 marks per paragraph, which is achievable for any student. We use our P.E.E.L paragraph approach to structure our paragraphs. That helps us bump up our OE. It improves our ability to evaluate and analyse the information that we're providing. And now we plan for essays. We plan big picture, what direction we want to go. What direction is the, I suppose, big picture macro of the essay going. Then we plan micro, what are the fine details looking like. So we're going to go through that now for the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And hopefully, we're going to write a couple of paragraphs together here today, just to show you how I'm using all of that in my writing. So our macro plan, let's look at this title. This essay question is very, very predictable. We see the word controversy, contentious. So it's the negotiations and the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. That's important we understand that we're not just dealing with the terms, we're not just dealing with the negotiation. It's the overall picture of that and placing that in the context of history in Ireland at that time. Why was it controversial? So the first thing we'll do is write an intro. I'll explicitly show us how we do that. Paragraph 1, we're going to outline the Irish delegation. We're going to look at possibly how this became a controversial issue. Paragraph 2, we're going to look at should have De Valera went to London. That's controversial in itself. Probably the biggest controversy surrounding the topic. We'll look at the British delegates and how, I suppose, when you compare them against the Irish delegates, we'll look at, was that kind of controversial, the lack of experience there on the Irish parts. Paragraph 4, we're going to cover Dev's external idea of external association. Not that that was controversial in itself, but the fact that Dev wasn't communicating this to the British delegation, and perhaps something with the message wasn't passed on very clearly, led to controversial terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Paragraph 5, the question of partition. Controversial in itself. Government of Ireland Act coming in, we're linking that into the Unionist Party as well. Paragraph 6, the oath, extremely controversial, breakdown of negotiations. Why the negotiations broke down? Because I suppose the event was contentious or controversial itself. And then we'll look at reaction in Ireland, outbreak of the Civil War, division in Irish society, the whole event of this preliminary negotiations, actual negotiations, and terms of this Anglo-Irish Treaty were controversial in itself. Last thing we'll do, and we're going to write one together, a conclusion for the essay. Now, what's important, I just want to highlight to you guys here, follow my cursor for me, is that look at the paragraph titles that I'm using. So when we went back and we were looking at our marking scheme and it told us what a paragraph could be, remember, it had to be an episode in a sequence of events. An episode, phase, or stage in a sequence of events. Every single paragraph here deals with an episode, phase in that sequence of events. So I'm not, there isn't a paragraph here. This would be a very typical mistake not a mistake the students could make, but perhaps they're not maximizing their ability to pick up marks here, where they'd actually write a paragraph comparing the Irish delegation and the British delegation. They're separate phases in this sequence of events. We need to deal with them in separate paragraphs. That's really important to understand. One idea, phase, stage in the sequence of events per paragraph. That's important. So let's have a look at, I suppose, a micro plan for this. So I'm going to go through this in extreme detail with you guys, and then I'm going to write a couple of paragraphs from this essay with you, just to show you how I'm using all the information that we've kind of covered from the marking scheme up to this point. So in our introduction, this is our formula for writing introductions, and it stays the same. I just like to explain the essay's approach. I like to just say to my students, let's get the intro done, dusted, out of the way, quick and nimble with it, and let's just move on. Generally, students won't pick up anywhere 7, 8, 9, 10 marks for their introduction, because we're just explaining the essay's approach. So let's just get it done. Like, it's always the hardest part is actually starting something. So how I ask students to write their introduction, I'm going to show you how we write one together towards the end here. They include a quote to introduce the essay and demonstrate evidence of outside reading. So from the start, I like to include a quote, because straight away I'm thinking about, okay, how am I going to influence the examiner's opinion here? Am I showing evidence of wide reading? That's the terms from the marking scheme. So I'm trying to do that from the first sentence there. Then we react to the essay question. So we use the key terms from the question in our answer and our reaction. We state the main arguments of our essay, and then we explain the approach of our essay. So I'm going to write our introduction together afterwards, but it would look something like this. So firstly, I'm going to discuss the Nazis' use of the SS, the SA, and the Gestapo to create a culture of terror. Secondly, I'll outline the escalation in Nazi treatment of Jews in the early years of their leadership. Now, so if we were writing this essay, I'd say, firstly, I'm going to discuss how the Irish delegation provided, I suppose, we'll discuss the controversy of the Irish why am I stuttering here? Sorry, guys. Firstly, by discussing the controversy surrounding the Irish delegates and the De Valera's decision not to attend the negotiations himself. Secondly, by outlining the role of De Valera's idea of external association and how that influenced the question of partition, that these provoked further controversy or something along those lines. We'll write it together now in 1 second. So let's get into the actual paragraphs. These are our micro plans. You'll see the amount of detail that's covered in it. This is to get us up to that H1 standard. Remember, we're looking for like 6 to 8 historically correct references per paragraph. So these micro plans cover those 6 to 8 historically correct references. So paragraph 1 is the Irish delegates. The first thing we're going to do is outline who was part of the Irish delegation. So like what we could discuss there is the spectrum of nationalism within the Dáil cabinet leading up to the talks. For example, Griffith was a moderate, Cathal Brugha was a militant Republican or an extreme Republican, while Collins fell somewhere between the two. We'd outline who, I suppose, consisted or who made up the Irish delegation: Robert Barton, Griffith, Collins, Duggan, Duffy, Childers, who were appointed to the Irish delegation. So then we'll discuss this idea of the plenipotentiaries. So define the term. So it means having full power to make agreements. Now we link it back in, we explain this evidence, discuss how this was controversial, that they were given this title, however that Dev instructs the delegates not to sign anything. So that provokes controversy in the negotiations. Technically, the Irish delegation had the power to make the agreement without discussing with Dev, but he instructed them not to sign anything. So they got mixed messages in that regard. And we could, if we had time, we probably covered enough anyway, we could look at the aims of the delegates. So they wanted to get a republic, restore unity of Ireland, so undo the Government of Ireland Act. So that's controversial in itself, undoing the Government of Ireland Act. So paragraph 2, we're going to cover, should Dev have gone to London? So we'll outline the preliminary discussions. So 14th of July, after ceasefire starts, Dev goes to London, meets George and outlines what he wants. End partition, totally independent republic. Lloyd George refused to even discuss. So then we discussed throughout August, they exchanged letters and looked to find a formula for discussions to continue. So they set up this conference in London. Now we outline why it was controversial that Dev didn't attend this conference. So some claimed that preliminary talks, Dev knew that the British would never accept the Republic and wanted others to take the blame. Others blamed the delegates for refusing to follow orders. You could possibly even give your opinion here, consider the middle ground. Dev had first-hand experience of negotiations with Lloyd George and wanted to give his delegates time to consider. That's, I suppose my opinion really on that topic. That Dev wasn't, I suppose, planning to throw his Irish delegates under the bus, but it was more so that he thought that by him not attending, they would be able to consider and have time to think about the options. That obviously wouldn't be the case. So paragraph 3, British delegates. So we're going to outline who represented Britain, what was their aims. So stress the experience of the British delegates here. So representatives from the coalition government, the wartime coalition government, which was Lloyd George, Churchill, Austen Chamberlain, Lord Birkenhead. They wanted to keep Ireland inside the empire, protect Ulster Unionists. Lloyd George did not think the British people cared. I love this quote from him, or I love this quote from Lord Salisbury, who was a Conservative MP at the time. The English voter had very little interest in and less understanding of Irish affairs. So really just summarises, I suppose, public opinion in Britain on Ireland at the time. What you could talk about here is as well the presence of Carson and Craig and how this provoked controversy. So publicly announced that the talks had nothing to do with Northern Ireland, as it was between Britain and Southern Ireland. So use of that phrase, Southern Ireland. Secretly was worried about the position of the Unionists on the outside. They were kept up to date constantly by the Conservatives. So what emerged as most contested elements of discussions? They could not agree on this idea of dominion status. So paragraph 4, we're dealing with Dev's idea of external association, and think about how we're going to make this, how we're going to outline to the examiner why this was controversial. So firstly, we'll define this external association. So it was Dev's idea that the British would let Ireland leave the empire, but Ireland would sign an alliance with Britain while recognising the British king as head of alliance. We can kind of outline here, was Dev naive to think that this idea would keep everyone happy? Discuss how the delegates might have struggled to explain this idea clearly to the British. Remember, it was Eamon de Valera's idea. Link it back to the controversy. Now we're seeing, I suppose, evidence or proof. Should de Valera have went to England or to London to explain his idea of external association to the British? So there's mixed messages, and there's, I suppose, just a breakdown in the chain of communication there. And we highlight back and forward of external association. So Irish delegates have proposed the idea, while Britain refused. They offer Dominion status, same as Canada. Griffith and Collins bring this idea to the Dáil 3 times. Each time the Dáil cabinet told them to go back and try again. Think about how that's going to provoke controversy for Collins and Griffith, who are at the negotiation table with Lloyd George, with Churchill, that they just keep coming back with the same idea. Was that really going to help the Irish delegates in their negotiations? So paragraph 5 is the question of partition, which obviously provokes controversy in itself. So this was the Irish delegates' priority. So they discussed the reality of this aim by Irish delegates. How would they propose to achieve the issue? Lloyd George offers to persuade Unionists to join an All-Ireland Parliament if the Irish delegates agreed to stay in the Empire. Why is this controversial? What does that show that the British are prioritising? That they're prioritising keeping Ireland in the Empire compared to keeping the Unionists happy, which they probably weren't telling, the Conservatives probably weren't telling the Unionists, weren't telling Carson and Craig at the time. Now we could outline what did the Unionists think of this. So Craig refuses to even meet Lloyd George to discuss. The idea of the Boundary Commission was put forward. Craig refuses, but he's in a very strong position as he already had Northern Ireland, the power of Northern Ireland in the Government of Ireland Act. So they can't just take that act back. Then this idea of the Boundary Commission comes up. Irish delegates promised it would transfer large parts of Ulster to the south. By accepting, the delegates were accepting partition. Discuss how that's going to be controversial. Think about the events that have taken place up to this point, the War of Independence. Like a lot of these Irish delegates, people who made up the Dáil in Ireland, they're brothers. I suppose this brotherhood that they were involved in, people that they fought with, had lost their life and given blood for Irish independence and to unite Ireland and partition. Now they were essentially accepting that with the Boundary Commission. Now that Boundary Commission is going to provide more controversy, as they don't actually gain any land from it anyway. So paragraph 6 is the oath. So first sentence, reiterate the degree of independence wanted by the Irish delegates and what the British could offer. So the Irish wanted complete control of everything to do with Ireland. British could only offer Dominion status, and argued that if the king had no power in Dominion status and was just a symbol. Could we discuss the controversy of symbols here in Ireland? How that symbolises the Irish people taking out to the British after people had given their life fighting for Irish freedom. There's a lot of symbolism there. There's a lot of controversy around that idea itself. So outline now why the oath, I've spelled that wrong, was considered controversial. Argue both sides of the story. Extreme Republicans claim that the Republic had been declared in 1916 with the proclamation, and it was confirmed by the elections of 1918, and there was blood martyrs who had died for that. That's controversial in itself, and it's extremely powerful to think about that. They state that all TDs had taken an oath to uphold the Republic, and taking an oath to the King was a betrayal of that. However, the pro-treaty argued that the oath is just words, and the treaty gives Irish powers to achieve freedom in the future. So think about that stepping stone for independence. Then we have our breakdown of negotiations. So we see divisions and controversy erupt in the Dáil on the 3rd of December. So the draft treaty states that the Irish Free State was to be a dominion of the Empire, King would be head of its state, and all TDs took an oath to him, and the Boundary Commission established if Northern Ireland opts out. Dáil accepts solution to partition. So they accepted the Boundary Commission. That's them accepting that Ireland would now be divided between North and South, but disagree about Dominion status and the oath to the King. Griffith suggests that if it wasn't a good enough offer, Dev should go to London himself. Link back to the early controversy. See how tensions, controversy, contentious opinions here keep erupting over the course of the negotiations. Then secondly, the talks break down. 4th of December, Collins refuses to go to Downing Street with the rejection. What does this show to the British? Shows that there's divisions in the Irish camp. Lloyd George is furious and breaks off the negotiations. He issues this ultimatum to the Irish delegates. So he says, this is your last chance to sign. He rewrites the oath, very similar. That's, I suppose, important to know. What Lloyd George had written was very similar to what Dev suggested in his external association. Was it now controversial that Collins, who was a committed Republican, signed the treaty? That's really, I suppose, it's really interesting and powerful to think about. If we think about the role Collins played in developing the spy network and how he was essentially the most wanted man in Britain at the time, he signed the treaty. Think about the symbolism of that as well, and that's going to provoke controversy in itself. The treaty was also signed at 2:10 a.m. What does that suggest? They were tired. Long negotiations, been going on for nearly 3 months at this stage. So that's how we see that breakdown in negotiations. Last paragraph, a reaction in Ireland. This is going to be controversial in itself. Firstly, outline the reaction in Dublin to the treaty. So most people were relieved. Republicans were furious. Dev was angry that they signed it without consultation. Outlined the main objections to the treaty. Dominion status, oath to the King, very little objection to partition. That's important. We can see that they've essentially given up on the idea of United Ireland there. Next, we have our split in the Dáil. So Collins, as president of the IRB, got its Supreme Council to back the treaty. Dev publicly condemns the treaty, breaks a tradition that disagreements within the Dáil are to be kept confidential. That's controversial in itself. That was an agreement between Dáil members that any disagreements would be kept inside the Dáil. Dev breaks this, speaks to the media. That's controversial. Split outside the Dáil. Active IRA members oppose the treaty. We see the formation of the anti-treaty IRA, or the Irregulars. Most normal people did not care about abstract ideas like the difference between Dominion status and a republic. That's really important there. Obviously, we see the development of the Civil War afterwards as well. And then conclusion, how we write all our conclusions. We restate the main ideas of our essay, short, sweet, snappy. When one considers, it is clear that we answer the so what questions. We need to explain why any of this matters, why the reader should care, and then we leave a kicker or lingering thought. So the last sentence should leave the reader nodding in agreement and feeling glad they bothered to read your essay. And I often say to my students, if you're stuck here, throw in a quote that looks to connect your ideas in the previous sentences. Let's have a look at how we write our introduction, write paragraph or two, and our conclusion here, just see how we are for time. So if we go back, I'm just going to flick back, guys, to our what we're trying to do in our intro, just to keep that fresh in your mind. So we're looking to include a quote to introduce the essay, demonstrate evidence of outside reading from the start. We're looking to react to the essay question, state the main argument of the essay, explain the approach. Let's see how I do that here for the Anglo-Irish treatment. So firstly, I'm going to include a quote to demonstrate evidence of outside reading. So Michael Collins rose looking as if he was going to shoot someone, preferably himself. In all my life, I have never seen so much passion and suffering in restraint. Winston Churchill on Collins' immediate reaction to signing the Anglo-Irish Treaty. What a quote that is, guys. If you think about, in the context of our essay question, controversy, we get I suppose a snapshot of what Michael Collins' reaction was. He wasn't happy, and that's going to be important. This essay will elaborate on the idea put forward by Churchill that both the negotiations and the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty was divisive and controversial. I'm using that keyword from the essay question as I state the main argument of my essay. Now we explain the approach. Firstly, by discussing the controversy surrounding the Irish delegates and De Valera's decision not to attend the negotiations himself. Secondly, by outlining how the role of De Valera's idea of external association and the questions of partition provoked further controversy. Recycling that word, I'm going to see that. I'm almost going to overdo that here to really show to the examiner, look at me, I'm answering the question. Thirdly, by stating how the idea of the oath resulted in a breakdown in negotiations and caused major controversy in Ireland. Finally, by highlighting the controversial nature of the treaty and how it caused widespread division in Irish society. So as I said, it's really short, snappy introduction. We just get it done, out of the way, show evidence of outside reading, state our main argument, explain the approach, and that leads us on to how we write our first paragraph. So let's have a look at how I'm using. Just what you'll note here, and I actually might highlight it to you, is the P.E.E.L paragraph approach as we go through. So the sources around the Anglo-Irish Treaty suggest that the controversy began before the negotiations or reaction had even taken place. Firstly, there was a widespread spectrum of nationalism already evident within the Dáil cabinet, leading up to the negotiations of the treaty. For example, Griffith was quite moderate, Brugha quite militant, while Collins fell somewhere in between the two men's ideologies. Additionally, the team of Robert Barton, Griffith, Collins, Eamon Duggan, Gavin Duffy and Erskine Childers that were appointed to the Irish delegation lacked the real negotiating experience that would be needed to contest with the British delegation. Furthermore, De Valera gave the delegation the power of plenipotentiaries, which means having full power to make agreements. However, historians consider this controversial, know how I'm using that word, as even though they were given this official title, De Valera instructed the delegates not to sign anything without consulting him. Consequently, the contradiction of these messages from De Valera would provoke controversy as the negotiations developed. Further, Taoiseach W.T. Cosgrave would describe this decision. It's like sending out a sports team but leaving your best player at home. I love that quote from future Taoiseach. We can therefore see that the responsibility placed on the Irish delegates with inconsistent messaging would inevitably lead to controversy as the negotiations for the treaty began. Let's just highlight this, okay? So first thing that I do is react to the question. Use the word controversy in that first statement. The sources suggest, notice how I'm using my phrases from our P.E.E.L paragraph approach. That's going to help structure the paragraph. The controversy began even before the negotiations or reaction had even taken place. Next thing we need to do is state the main argument. So I've kind of done that there in the first sentence as well. Now we need to provide 6 to 8 historically correct references. So I've got 6 there. Very, very straightforward. What I do really well in this paragraph, I know I'm speaking about myself there, but what this paragraph does really well is explains the evidence as we go through. So there's a lot of explanations there. Look at the word consequently. You could talk about how I explained this term plenipotentiaries. Where is it? Which means having full power to make agreements. So we're explaining the evidence as we progress through the essay. We have evidence of outside reading or watching. So we have our quote from W.T. Cosgrave, who's future Taoiseach. It's a really easy quote, really powerful quote as well. And then the last thing we do is link your argument back to the question. So we can therefore see that responsibility placed on delegates with inconsistent messaging would inevitably lead to controversy. Important we recycle that word in our essay, and we've used linking words throughout. Firstly, secondly, consequently, we can therefore see the sources suggest all the good stuff from our P.E.E.L paragraph. And then finally, guys, our conclusion. So to conclude, this essay has addressed several significant issues that show that both the negotiations and terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty provoked widespread controversy in Irish society. Firstly, by discussing the controversy surrounding the Irish delegates and De Valera's decision to not attend the negotiations himself. Secondly, by outlining how the role of De Valera's idea of external association and the questions of partition provoked further controversy. Thirdly, by stating how the idea of the oath resulted in a breakdown in negotiations and caused major controversy in Ireland. Finally, by highlighting the controversial nature of the treaty and how it caused widespread division in Irish society. Now I'm going to use a quote to, I suppose, just include our kicking or lingering thought here. Historian Ronan Fanning describes the event as the most controversial decision of his career, further stating De Valera opposed the treaty not because it was a compromise, but because it was not his compromise. Now I'm going to just expand or elaborate or link that. Without doubt, it can be stated that the Anglo-Irish Treaty was a landmark event in the development of a sovereign Irish Free State. However, one can imagine alternative realities where different decisions were made and how that could have affected events that would unfold in the immediate years after. And then we have our conclusion, and you can just see all those references to our good historical writing there. So that's us, folks. 4 minutes early. Thanks for giving up your time of a Saturday. It's greatly appreciated, and I'll speak to you in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.